In a dusty hill town of roughly 400 residents, where everyone was familiar with everyone else's affairs, where soldiers from Rome kept watch over the surrounding roads, a young carpenter by the name of Jesus lived for 3 decades before he transformed the world in ways nobody could have imagined. And here's the remarkable thing. Nazareth receives barely any mention in the Bible, and yet this tiny village molded the Son of God in profound ways that would shape the entire trajectory of human history. What was daily existence truly like in the neighborhood where Jesus lived? What sights greeted him each day as he walked those age-old streets? And for what reason did God select this particular location, looked down upon by those in positions of religious authority, as the place to bring up the Savior of humanity? But before you settle in, please take just a moment to like this video and subscribe, though only if you truly enjoy the content I create here. I'm grateful you're joining me today. As I always do, I'd be interested to hear where in the world you're watching from. Drop a comment letting us know, and mention what time it happens to be where you are. It genuinely helps us feel like the worldwide community we truly are. So now, shall we get into today's story? The village nobody noticed. A look at the town that formed a savior. Picture yourself standing at the rim of a limestone ridge in the region known as Lower Galilee. Spread out below you is a shallow depression encircled by hills that capture the early morning sunlight. A small number of stone dwellings gather close to a spring. Fields built into terraces make their way up the hillsides. Ancient olive trees twist their gnarled trunks skyward. This is first-century Nazareth. Compact, tranquille, overlooked by virtually everyone of importance. Yet this village, barely worth a footnote in the historical records of its era, became home to Jesus of Nazareth. The individual who would fundamentally reshape the story of humanity spent his formative years right here. He took his first steps on these limestone footpaths. He labored with his own 2 hands in these very streets. The question that echoes across the centuries presents itself once more. What was life genuinely like in this particular place? The Gospel writers referred to Nazareth as his patris. This word signifies more than simply a hometown. It carries with it the full weight of identity, of truly belonging, of the earth itself that molds you into who you eventually become. Every human being carries the imprint of their patris. The terrain around you seeps deep into your very bones. The pattern of changing seasons becomes your own internal pattern. The manner in which your neighbors communicate becomes the way you speak. Nazareth shaped Jesus in ways we frequently fail to recognize. We talk about the Incarnation as God taking on human form, but the Incarnation was far more particular than that. God became, specifically, a first-century craftsman from Galilee, originating from an unknown village that the majority of people had never even encountered. The Son of God spoke with the accent of a Nazarene. He was familiar with the flavor of Nazarene water drawn from the community spring. He grasped intimately the specific challenges of subsistence living in a region occupied by Rome and considered a backwater. This level of specificity is significant. The Christian faith doesn't begin with theoretical philosophy. It begins with dirt beneath fingernails and rough spots on the palms of hands. It begins with an actual place where actual people ground their grain and mended their plows, and observed the sun setting behind the very same hills their ancestors had watched. Nazareth was so insignificant that it doesn't show up in any ancient historical records prior to the Gospels making mention of it. Josephus, the renowned Jewish historian who cataloged nearly every settlement throughout Galilee, never once names it. The Hebrew Bible, covering thousands upon thousands of years of recorded history, keeps total silence regarding Nazareth. The Talmud would eventually list 63 towns in Galilee. Nazareth isn't included in that list. The village sat nestled in its basin, almost like a secret. The major roadways passed in the vicinity, but never actually went through it. Sepphoris, the gleaming regional capital of Galilee, was located only about an hour's walk toward the northwest. Trading caravans traveled the commercial routes connecting the coast of the Mediterranean to the territories further inland. Yet these routes went around Nazareth. If you wanted to arrive at the village, you needed to deliberately set out to go there. Nobody came upon Nazareth simply by chance. This lack of prominence shaped the individuals who made their lives there. They weren't people of the world. They weren't considered refined in the eyes of city dwellers from Jerusalem or from Rome. They spoke the Aramaic language with a pronounced Galilean accent that identified them immediately as country people. They were those who farmed and those who worked with their hands, people who understood their position in the hierarchy of the Roman world. And that position was close to the very bottom. Yet something of profound importance took place in this place of no consequence. The angel Gabriel made an appearance to a young woman whose name was Mary. The message he delivered would reverberate throughout all eternity. The Word took on flesh, not within the marble corridors of Rome, not in the temple complex found in Jerusalem, but inside a modest house in a village so utterly unimportant that people would eventually question whether anything worthwhile could possibly emerge from such a location. To understand Nazareth is to understand the revolutionary nature of what Christians refer to as the gospel. The good news didn't descend from the seats of power. It emerged from the edges. It spoke first to the forgotten ones, the overlooked ones, those whose names never appeared in any official documentation. The King of all kings grew up in a location that possessed no king, no royal palace, no military force, no library, no theater, just limestone and hard work and the gradual turning of the seasons. Walk through what remains archaeologically today, and you discover the remnants of ordinary existence. Cisterns carved directly into bedrock, presses for olives, pits dug for storing grain, pots used for cooking, lamps fueled by oil. The material remains of subsistence living. These are the artifacts belonging to the world Jesus knew. The background sounds of the Incarnation. Nazareth was home. More than just that, Nazareth became part of his very identity. Jesus of Nazareth. This phrase shows up repeatedly throughout the Gospels. Even those who opposed him used it. The inscription placed above the cross would declare, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Those who followed him became known as the Nazarenes. The name of the village became impossible to separate from the movement that would eventually transform the entire Roman Empire. This paradox requires our full attention. The God who exists eternally chose a specific time and a specific place. He chose first-century Galilee. He chose a village so tiny that the vast majority of people had never heard its name spoken. The implications extend in every possible direction. If the divine can make its dwelling in Nazareth, then there exists no place beyond the reach of sacred purpose. If the Messiah can emerge from total obscurity, then there exists no person too insignificant to receive God's attention. The story of Nazareth is fundamentally the story of hidden things being brought into the light. It's the story of the last ones becoming the first. It's the story of a village that had absolutely no reason to be important except for one single extraordinary fact. The Son of Man called it his home. The centuries of silence. Nazareth, in the time before Christ. Silence hangs heavy over the Nazareth basin throughout most of documented history. Dig down through the layers archaeologists have uncovered, and the evidence becomes sparse. The Late Bronze Age leaves behind almost nothing to examine. The Iron Age provides scattered fragments of pottery, and not much beyond that. For century after century, this particular location sat at the very edge of human activity throughout the region. The absence of evidence tells a story all its own. During the momentous events of ancient Near Eastern history, Nazareth simply wasn't present as any settlement of significance. When the military forces of Egypt and Mesopotamia clashed in battle, their roots went elsewhere. When the kingdoms of the northern tribes and the southern tribes experienced their rise and eventual fall, Nazareth remained entirely outside that narrative. The Hebrew scriptures make record of hundreds and hundreds of place names. Nazareth doesn't number among them. This silence creates questions for those engaged in studying the historical Jesus. Certain scholars during the 19th and 20th centuries raised doubts about whether Nazareth even existed at all during the first century. Their argument proceeded as follows. No source prior to Christianity makes mention of it. As a result, it must be an invention from a later period. But archaeological work has put this debate to rest. The village was definitely there. It was simply far too small and far too lacking in importance to catch the attention of historians and those who kept chronicles. Excavations conducted in the latter part of the 20th century brought to light the earliest definite evidence of people living there. Agricultural installations carved directly into the limestone bedrock can be dated to the Hellenistic period, approximately the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era. These include installations for pressing wine, installations for pressing olives, and facilities for storage. Those who settled here were farmers who worked the productive soil found in the basin and on the terraced slopes rising above it. The population likely numbered somewhere between 200 and 400 people at the very most during this early time period. Compare this to Sepphoris, the regional capital located nearby, which contained perhaps 20,000 inhabitants when it reached its peak. Nazareth was a hamlet, a grouping of extended family units where everyone recognized every single face in the village. The sort of place where everyone knew the business of everyone else, and privacy was a luxury nobody got to experience. The Jezreel Valley extends outward to the north of Nazareth. This wide plain functioned as a corridor for military forces throughout the span of history. Forces from Egypt marched their way through. Conquerors from Assyria passed along. The valley was witness to battles that determined the fate of empires. But the Nazareth Basin, shielded by its surrounding hills and distant from the primary routes, stayed largely unaffected by these military conflicts. The settlers who eventually established Nazareth as a community were Jewish. This becomes evident from what the archaeological record shows. They constructed ritual baths known as mikva'at. They made use of stone vessels for storing water in accordance with purity laws. They kept pig bones out of their refuse piles, following dietary restrictions. These physical traces point toward a community with deep roots in Jewish tradition and religious practice. The timing of Nazareth's emergence as a village aligns with wider patterns observable throughout Galilee. During the Hasmonean period spanning the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, Jewish settlement expanded across the entire region. Communities that had been left abandoned or had lost population were reconstructed. New villages came into existence. Nazareth was part of this wave of people resettling the area. The people who came to make Nazareth their home likely had their origins in Judean families. They may have been refugees or migrants in search of land and new opportunity in the northern territories. Galilee had space to offer. The soil was of good quality. Springs supplied water. For families willing to put in hard work and carve out an existence from limestone and clay, the region held real promise. But why would anyone make the choice to settle in such an isolated spot? The answer can be found in agriculture. The Nazareth Basin, though limited in size, contains soil of excellent quality. Spring water emerges naturally from the limestone. The hills and the surrounding area can be terraced to support olive trees and grapevines. For farmers living at the subsistence level, these factors held more importance than being close to trade routes or urban centers. The name of the village itself may provide clues. Nazareth in the Hebrew language is Natzrat or Natzrat. Some scholars make a connection to the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch or shoot. Others propose it comes from a root meaning to guard or to keep watch. The origin of the word remains a matter of uncertainty. What we do know is that by the time Jesus was born, the name had become permanently attached to this specific place. Life during these early centuries would have been difficult. Winters delivered cold rains. Summers baked the hillsides until they were dry. Farming in the world of the ancients meant unending labor, plowing the fields, planting the seed, pulling the weeds, bringing in the harvest, threshing the grain. The cycle was perpetual. Beyond agricultural work, the villagers had need of craftsmen, somebody to construct houses, somebody to repair the tools, somebody to weave fabric. The population stayed stable and small across generations. There was no boom in population, no expansion extending beyond the narrow limits of the basin. Nazareth grew at a slow pace, if it grew at all. The village looked inward, concentrating on survival and on preserving Jewish religious practice in a region coming under increasing influence from Greek culture. Religious life had its center in the synagogue, though no archaeological evidence of a synagogue building from the 1st century has been discovered in Nazareth. This shouldn't come as a surprise. Early synagogues frequently met in private homes or simple structures that left behind very little physical trace. What held importance wasn't the building itself, but rather the gathering, the reading aloud of Torah, the offering of prayers, the maintenance of covenant identity in a world under the dominance of Rome. The Roman Empire cast its long shadow over Galilee by the 1st century before the Common Era. Pompey brought the region under conquest in 63 before the Common Era. Herod the Great ruled as a client king, undertaking the rebuilding of Sepphoris after it suffered destruction in a revolt. His son, Herod Antipas, would in later times make Sepphoris even more magnificent, transforming it into a display of Roman architecture and urban design. However, these significant events barely touched Nazareth in any meaningful way. The village paid the taxes it owed. Its young men on occasion faced being conscripted for labor on building projects. Beyond that, the empire left it to itself. There were no Roman soldiers positioned there, no Roman officials present, no temples dedicated to Caesar. Just Jewish farmers and craftsmen continuing to live as their ancestors before them had lived, waiting for the fulfillment of promises written down in ancient scrolls. Into this state of obscurity, at the hinge point separating the old age from the new, came the announcement that would alter everything. The silent centuries were on the verge of coming to an end. A more detailed examination, the geographical and social context of Galilee. Lower Galilee rises and descends in a rhythm of ridges and valleys. Limestone forms the structural foundation of the land. Springs come bubbling up wherever the rock permits. The soil, when terraced and properly cared for, produces grain, grapes, and olives. This is not the severe wilderness found in Judea to the south. Galilee is greener, more abundant, more forgiving toward those who put in the work. Nazareth occupies a bowl-shaped valley, nestled between hills that offer shelter. Toward the northwest, Mount Precipice rises in a sharp ascent. Toward the north, the land slopes in the direction of the Jezreel Valley, that ancient corridor where military forces have marched since time beyond our ability to remember. Toward the south and east, additional hills. The location of the village provides protection. Raiders and soldiers have a tendency to follow the paths of least resistance. Nazareth was situated off the well-traveled track, but proximity to major routes still held importance. The Via Maris, the way of the sea, passed through Galilee. This ancient trade route created a connection between Egypt and Damascus and the lands beyond. Caravans transported goods from Africa and the Mediterranean northward to Mesopotamia and the eastern territories. Sepphoris, only an hour's walk from Nazareth, sat near enough to this route to gain advantage from trade. Nazareth was near enough to remain aware of what was taking place in the wider world, but distant enough to stay clear of much of the trouble that accompanied it. Water determined everything. The spring in Nazareth, known in the present day as Mary's Well, supplied the lifeblood of the community. In the absence of it, the village could not have existed. Women came on a daily basis to draw water. They transported it in jars balanced on top of their heads or upon their shoulders. The spring became a place of gathering. Information spread there. Rumors circulated. Marriages received their arrangements. The spring was more than simply a source of water. It functioned as the social center of the village. Galilee, during the 1st century, was a complicated mixture of cultures and peoples. Jewish communities held dominance, but Greek influence was present everywhere. Sepphoris, reconstructed by Herod Antipas, put Roman architecture on display. Greek was spoken in the marketplaces right alongside Aramaic. Gentile cities formed a ring around the region. Ptolemais on the coast, Tyre and Sidon toward the north, the cities of the Decapolis toward the east. Jewish Galilee existed in ongoing contact with the world that wasn't Jewish. This contact gave birth to suspicion from Judeans in the south. The people of Jerusalem viewed Galileans as country relatives at best. At worst, they raised questions about their religious purity. Had they engaged in intermarriage with Gentiles? Had they made compromises regarding their Jewish identity? The Galilean accent marked those who spoke with it as outsiders when they came to Jerusalem. When Peter would in later times be identified as one who followed Jesus, his accent gave him away. The Judean prejudice had roots that went deep. Galilee had experienced separation from Judea for centuries. During the Assyrian conquest in the 8th century before the Common Era, the northern kingdom was the first to fall. Foreign peoples were brought in. The population became mixed. When the Hasmoneans reconquered the region, they found it necessary to reconvert or reintegrate communities that had drifted away from Orthodox practice. The memory of this historical background persisted. However, Galilean Jews were intensely devoted to their faith. They made pilgrimages to Jerusalem for the great festivals. They observed Torah. They performed circumcision on their sons. They kept the Sabbath. They maintained ritual purity. The archaeological evidence provides support for this. Galilean sites display consistent patterns of Jewish material culture. The accusation of religious laxness was more a matter of prejudice than actual reality. The economy of Galilee revolved around the production of food. The region possessed the ability to feed itself and generate surplus for export. Grain from the Jezreel Valley, olive oil pressed in countless village installations, wine from vineyards on the hillsides, fish from the Sea of Galilee preserved with salt and shipped throughout the empire. Galilee was wealthy in comparison to the rocky hills of Judea. This prosperity drew attention. Rome imposed heavy taxation on the land. Herod Antipas, ruling in his role as tetrarch, required revenue to provide funding for his building projects and maintain his position. The burden came down upon farmers and craftsmen. They paid taxes to Rome through the system of Herod. They paid the temple tax to provide support for the priesthood in Jerusalem. They paid rent if they worked land that belonged to absentee landlords. The system placed them under pressure. Social tensions existed beneath the surface. The ruling class in Sepphoris lived lives of comfort. They constructed houses with floors made of mosaic. They attended theaters. They adopted the fashions of Rome. Meanwhile, farmers in villages such as Nazareth struggled to retain enough of their harvest to provide food for their families. This disparity created resentment. It generated conditions favorable for unrest. Galileans had earned a reputation for rebellion. Judas of Galilee led a revolt in opposition to Roman taxation in the year 6 of the Common Era, just as Jesus was in his growing years. The revolt was put down, but the spirit of resistance continued to live on. Zealots and those committed to revolution would continue to emerge throughout the 1st century. The region possessed a streak of defiance that caused concern for Roman governors. Into this world of tension between different cultures, between those with wealth and those without, between collaboration and resistance, Jesus was born. Nazareth itself stood at some distance from the most intense pressures. It was too small in size to draw much notice. However, the forces giving shape to Galilee gave shape to Nazareth as well. The taxes still required payment. The Roman soldiers still kept patrol throughout the region. The great world continued to press in upon the small village, whether those who resided there desired it or not. The geography isolated Nazareth to a sufficient degree. The social context of Galilee embedded it within the larger conflicts of the age. This combination would prove to be significant. Jesus grew up with knowledge of the quiet rhythms belonging to village life, while simultaneously being conscious of the great forces of empire and revolution moving in circles around him. He was provincial, yet not lacking in awareness. He was from the margins, yet not severed from the center. The land itself gave shape to faith. The farmers of Galilee understood dependence. Rain needed to come at the proper time. Springs needed to continue flowing. Crops needed to reach ripeness. Disaster was always just one drought or one tax increase away. This dependence gave birth to a particular kind of devotion. Trust in God wasn't abstract theology. It represented the difference between having food and going hungry. The Galilean landscape shows up repeatedly throughout Jesus' teaching. Seeds and different types of soil, lilies growing in the field, birds flying through the air, shepherds and their sheep, grain and the harvest. His parables have their roots in this place. The geography of Galilee became the geography of the kingdom of God within his words. The familiar made strange, the ordinary revealed as possessing sacredness. The Annunciation, the moment when Nazareth entered into history. The Gospel of Luke situates the moment with precision. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel to a town in Galilee that was called Nazareth. The geography holds importance for Luke. He names the region. He names the town. He anchors the cosmic event within a specific location that the vast majority of his readers would never have encountered. Gabriel came to a virgin who was pledged to be married to a man by the name of Joseph. Her name was Mary. The angel entered into her presence and spoke words that would echo down through history. Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you. Mary was troubled. Luke tells us this in plain terms. The appearance of an angel wasn't an experience that brought comfort. Gabriel found it necessary to tell her not to be afraid. Then came the message itself. She would conceive and give birth to a son. She was to give him the name Jesus. He would be great, and would be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God would grant him the throne of his father David. He would reign over the descendants of Jacob forever. His kingdom would never come to an end. The promise held layers of meaning that any Jewish listener would immediately recognize. The throne of David pointed backward to the great king and forward to the hope for a Messiah. The eternal kingdom echoed prophecies that had sustained the Jewish people through centuries of exile and oppression. The Son who would bring salvation to his people from their sins carried the weight of every failed rebellion, every hope that had been crushed, every prayer offered for deliverance. Mary asked the question that was obvious. How could this take place when she was a virgin? Gabriel provided explanation that the Holy Spirit would come upon her. The power of the Most High would overshadow her. Therefore, the Holy One to be born would be called the Son of God. As evidence, Gabriel pointed to Elizabeth, Mary's relative, who was carrying a child in her old age, despite having been barren. Nothing was impossible when God was involved. Mary's response has received analysis by theologians for 2,000 years. I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. In that moment when she gave her consent, the incarnation became possible. The eternal Word made preparation to enter into time. The Creator made preparation to become part of creation. All of this had its beginning in a small house in Nazareth. The theological significance is enormous, but the geographical significance deserves attention of equal measure. God could have made the choice of Jerusalem, the holy city where the temple had its location. He could have made the choice of Bethlehem, the city of David. He could have made the choice of Sepphoris, the magnificent capital located nearby. Instead, the announcement came to Nazareth. This choice brings revelation of something essential regarding the nature of God's action within the world. The gospel doesn't have its beginning at the center. It has its beginning at the margins. It doesn't make its announcement to those with power. It comes to those without power. A peasant girl in a forgotten village receives information that will shake empires to their foundations. Luke structures his narrative in a way that emphasizes the contrast. Just before the Annunciation to Mary, he recounts the announcement to Zechariah in the temple. Zechariah was a priest engaged in performing sacred duties in the holy place. Gabriel appeared to him there in the very heart of Jewish religious life. But Zechariah expressed doubt and was struck silent as a result. Then the scene undergoes a shift from the temple to a house, from a priest to a peasant girl, from the center of religious authority to the periphery of the known world. Mary believed where Zechariah had doubted. The unlikely became the chosen. The location of the Annunciation also brings transformation to Nazareth itself prior to this moment. The town was nothing, a place that made no mark upon history. Following this moment, Nazareth becomes the hometown of the Messiah. Its name becomes impossible to separate from the identity of Jesus. Every single time someone says Jesus of Nazareth, they invoke this event and this place. The house where the Annunciation took place became an object receiving veneration in later centuries. Byzantine Christians constructed a church over the traditional site. Crusaders undertook its rebuilding. Modern pilgrims pay visits to the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth in the present day. The exact location may be subject to debate, but the significance of the place cannot be questioned. Mary would soon depart from Nazareth to pay a visit to Elizabeth in the hill country of Judea. The Magnificat, her great song offering praise, would be sung in the house of Elizabeth, not in Nazareth. But she would make her return. Nazareth was home. This was the place where she would bring up the child. This was the place where Jesus would experience growth from infant to boy to man. The Annunciation marks the hinge of salvation history. Everything that came before it was preparation. Everything that comes after it flows out from it. And it took place in Nazareth. The most significant moment in Christian theology occurred in a place so small it shows up on no maps from the period. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the ministry of Jesus. He ate meals with tax collectors and with sinners. He made physical contact with lepers. He performed healing on the Sabbath. He welcomed children. He praised the faith of a Roman centurion and of a Canaanite woman. He told those who followed him that the last would be first, and the first would be last. The geography of the Annunciation foreshadows the entire ministry. The purposes of God run contrary to human expectations. The angel took his departure. Mary gave thought to these things deep in her heart. Life in Nazareth went on. The spring continued to flow. Farmers continued to work in their fields. Craftsmen continued to build and to repair. But everything had undergone change. The Word was in the process of becoming flesh. The light was making preparation to enter into the darkness. And Nazareth, insignificant Nazareth, stood at the very center of the greatest event in the history of humanity, the hidden years, daily life inside a first-century Nazareth home. The typical house found in Nazareth would have been small in size and simple in design. Limestone blocks formed the walls, quarried from the plentiful local stone. The floor was earth-packed down hard, sometimes covered with plaster. A single room served purposes of multiple kinds: cooking, sleeping, working, living. Privacy, as we have understanding of it, had no existence. Many houses were constructed into or against the hillside, using the natural rock as one of the walls. This provided insulation in opposition to summer heat and winter cold. The roof consisted of wooden beams with a covering of branches, reeds, and mud packed down. It required regular maintenance, or it would develop leaks when the rains arrived. Stairs on the exterior led up to the roof, which functioned as additional living space when the weather was good. Inside, furnishings were kept to a minimum. Stone benches ran along the walls. Sleeping mats were rolled out when night came. Clay jars held grain, oil, and water. A cooking hearth occupied one corner or was positioned outside in a courtyard. Metal tools were expensive and of great value. Most implements were made of stone or wood. Lighting came from small oil lamps that gave off a dim, flickering light. The courtyard was the heart of daily life. Extended families frequently shared a courtyard complex. Several small rooms opened onto a common space where much of the work took place. Women ground grain here using hand mills, circular stones that demanded hours of labor each day. They baked bread in small ovens made of clay. They prepared food. They spun thread and wove cloth. The diet was simple but sufficient when harvests came in well. Bread formed the foundation of every single meal. Barley bread for those who were poor, wheat bread for those who had the means to afford it. Olive oil provided fat and added flavor. Lentils, beans, and chickpeas offered protein. Onions, leeks, and garlic added taste. Figs and dates supplied sweetness. Fish, dried or salted, came from the Sea of Galilee. Meat was uncommon, set aside for special occasions and festivals. Water came from the spring in the village. Women walked there on a daily basis, often making multiple trips, carrying large jars. This was labor of a difficult kind. A water jar, when full, could weigh 30 pounds or even more. But it was also time for social interaction. The women engaged in conversation. They shared information. They made arrangements for marriages involving their children. The spring was where the life of the village was negotiated and kept going. Clothing was equally simple in nature. Men wore a tunic, a single piece of fabric with holes for the head and arms. Over this, a cloak for providing warmth. Sandals gave protection to feet. A head covering provided shield against the sun. The fabrics were wool or linen, undyed or colored naturally. Only the wealthy possessed the ability to afford the purple and scarlet dyes that indicated status. Women wore tunics of similar kind, often of longer length. They covered their heads when in public. Jewelry was uncommon and of great value. A woman might own a few coins strung together as a headpiece or necklace. To lose one of these coins, as in the parable Jesus would later tell, was a genuine crisis of real consequence. Children worked from a young age. Boys provided help to their fathers. Girls provided help to their mothers. By age 6 or 7, a child faced the expectation to contribute to the economy of the household. Play took place, but it fit itself around work. Education for boys had its beginning at the synagogue, where they gained the ability to read Torah. Girls received teaching in domestic skills at home. The rhythm of life followed the sun and the changing seasons. People rose when dawn came. Work filled the hours of daylight. Evening brought rest. The Sabbath interrupted this pattern on a weekly basis. On the seventh day, work came to a stop. Families came together. They walked to the synagogue. They prayed. They rested. This rhythm gave shape to time itself. The agricultural calendar held dominance over the year, plowing and planting in autumn following the first rains, growth taking place through winter, harvest in late spring and early summer. The grape harvest arrived in late summer, olive harvest in autumn. Between these major events, constant maintenance, pulling weeds, pruning, making repairs to terraces, tending to animals. Festivals marked points throughout the year. Passover in spring commemorating the Exodus from Egypt. Weeks, or Pentecost, 50 days later, celebrating the harvest of grain. Tabernacles in autumn calling to memory the wandering in the wilderness. These festivals carried with them the requirement of pilgrimage to Jerusalem when possible. For a family in Nazareth, the journey required several days on foot. Extended family formed the basic unit of society. A household might include grandparents, parents, children, and siblings who were unmarried. Marriages received their arrangements. Girls married at a young age, often in their mid-teens. Boys married at a later time when they possessed the ability to support a family. Marriage wasn't primarily about romance. It was about alliance, survival, and the continuation of the line of the family. Honor and shame. Honor and shame held governance over social relations. The reputation of a family had to be guarded with great care. The behavior of women reflected upon the entire household. Any hint of sexual impropriety brought shame upon everyone. Men had to demonstrate strength and reliability. Failure to provide or protect meant loss of honor. In this world, a pregnancy outside of marriage was catastrophic. Mary's condition would have become obvious within a matter of months. The village was too small for anything to be hidden. Joseph's decision to take her as his wife, despite the circumstances, went against every single social norm. It required either divine revelation or love that went beyond honor, or both. Jesus grew up within this environment. He learned to walk on floors of packed earth and paths of limestone. He ate barley bread and lentils. He watched as his mother drew water and ground grain. He learned the trade of his father. He observed the Sabbath. He heard Torah read and explained within the synagogue. He made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The mundane details hold importance. The incarnation wasn't abstract in nature. God didn't merely give the appearance of being human. He lived a human life in all of its concrete particularity. He experienced hunger. He experienced exhaustion. He experienced the ache of muscles following a long day's work. He knew the taste of the cooking his mother prepared. He knew the smell of olive oil lamps and wood smoke and sweat. This was the hidden life. Luke tells us only that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people. The years between infancy and ministry remain largely unknown, but we possess the ability to reconstruct the context. We have knowledge of what life was like in a village such as Nazareth. We have knowledge of the rhythms and routines. Jesus lived them. The hidden years were formative in nature. The carpenter's son from Nazareth gained knowledge of the scriptures. He gained knowledge of how to pray. He gained knowledge of how to work with his hands. He gained knowledge of what it meant to be human in a specific time and place. When he began to teach, his words would have their roots in this experience. The parables would reflect this world. The kingdom of God would be described using the language of Galilean farmers and craftsmen. Nothing in Nazareth went to waste. Even the obscurity served a purpose. The Messiah didn't arrive with fanfare and with credentials. He arrived as a baby in a family of the working class in a village nobody had heard of. He grew up in a manner like any other Jewish boy in Galilee. This was the scandal and the glory of the incarnation. God became truly human. He lived a life that was truly human. And he did this in Nazareth, the economy of Nazareth. Carpentry, agriculture, and staying alive. The economy of Nazareth had its rest on two foundations: agriculture and work in the crafts. Most families worked the land. A smaller number practiced trades that provided support to the community. Together, these activities created an economy of subsistence where survival had dependence upon the labor of every member of the household. The agricultural work followed the ancient pattern belonging to Mediterranean farming. The Nazareth Basin and the hillsides in the surrounding area provided sufficient arable land for the small population. Families owned or rented plots of small size. They grew barley and wheat in the areas that were flat. They terraced the slopes for vines and olive trees. Every bit of land that was usable received cultivation. The olive tree held dominance over the agricultural landscape. Olive oil functioned in multiple ways. It provided calories and fat within the diet. It fueled lamps. It was used for cooking and for anointing in ritual. The trees themselves were assets of great value passed down through the generations. An olive grove that was established meant stability and relative prosperity. Pressing olives required equipment of a specialized kind. Large stone presses carved into bedrock still mark ancient Nazareth. The process was labor-intensive in nature. The olives were crushed. The pulp was placed into baskets that were woven. Weight was applied to extract the oil. The first pressing produced the oil of finest quality. Subsequent pressings produced grades of lower quality. Nothing went to waste. Grapes grew on hillsides built into terraces. The vintage arrived in late summer. Families picked the clusters and carried them to presses for wine, also carved from stone. Feet trampled upon the grapes. The juice flowed into vats for collection. Fermentation had its beginning almost immediately. Wine was safer for drinking than water in many instances, and provided calories as well. Grain required work of a different kind. Plowing broke the ground that was hard. This was accomplished with a plow made of wood, often just a forked branch with a tip of iron, pulled by an ox or donkey. The farmer walked behind, providing guidance to the plow. Planting followed the plow. The grain grew through the winter. Harvest arrived in late spring. Harvesting was work for the community. Everyone who possessed the ability to hold a sickle helped. The grain that was cut was bundled into sheaves. These were carried to the threshing floor, an area that was flat with hard-packed earth or stone. Oxen trampled upon the grain or pulled a sledge for threshing over it. This separated the kernels from the stalks. Then came winnowing. Workers tossed the mixture into the air using wooden forks. The wind carried the chaff away. The grain that was heavier fell back to the floor. The grain was stored in pits carved into limestone, or in large jars made of pottery. It had to provide until the next harvest. Careful rationing was of essential importance. A harvest that failed meant hunger. 2 harvests that failed meant famine. Beyond farming, Nazareth had need of craftsmen. Somebody had to construct houses. Somebody had to make and repair tools. Somebody had to weave cloth. The village was too small to provide support for many trades of a specialized nature, but certain skills were essential. Joseph was a tekton. This Greek word shows up in the Gospels to provide description of his occupation. Traditional translations render it as carpenter, but tekton means more than one who works with wood. It refers to a builder, a craftsman who worked with materials of multiple kinds. Wood, certainly, but also stone. A tekton constructed houses. He made repairs to roofs. He made doors and frames for windows. He constructed installations for agriculture. He fashioned yokes for oxen and plows for fields. The trade of the tekton required skill and strength. The work was physical in nature, lifting timbers of heavy weight, shaping stone, wielding tools made of iron. The hands of a tekton bore calluses and scars. Jesus learned this trade from Joseph. When he later taught in the synagogue at Nazareth, the people asked, "Isn't this the tekton?" They knew him as a working man. The materials for this work came from the area in the surrounding region. Limestone was abundant. Timber was more scarce. Trees suitable for building had to be purchased or cut from groves under management. Good wood was expensive. This shaped the manner in which buildings were constructed. Stone bore the weight. Wood was used in a sparing manner for roofs and doors. The tools of a tekton were of great value. Adzes for shaping wood, chisels for stone, mallets, saws, a plumb line for ensuring walls were straight. These tools represented investment of a significant kind. They were maintained with great care and passed from father to son. The economic relationship between craftsmen and farmers was symbiotic in nature. Farmers had need of buildings and tools. They paid the tekton in grain, oil, or wine. Sometimes they paid in labor, providing help with a building project in exchange for the skills of the craftsman. Cash money had existence, but was not the primary medium of exchange in an economy of the village. The proximity of Nazareth to Sepphoris created opportunity. When Herod Antipas undertook the rebuilding and expansion of Sepphoris in the early part of the 1st century, enormous amounts of work in construction became available. It is entirely plausible that Joseph and Jesus walked the short distance to Sepphoris to work on these projects. The pay would have been better than what could be earned within the village. The exposure to urban life and to culture that was Greco-Roman would have been significant. But this work also had a cost attached. Sepphoris represented the collaboration between the Jewish elite and the power of Rome. Working there meant taking part in a system that oppressed the people through taxation and cultural pressure. Some Galileans refused such work based on principle. Others had need of the income to survive. The economic pressure upon Galilean villagers was real and constant. Rome made demands for taxes. These were collected by publicans, local agents who often added fees of their own. Herod Antipas had need of revenue for his building projects and for his own lifestyle. The temple in Jerusalem expected what was due to it. All of this came out of the surplus produced by farmers and craftsmen. When the surplus was small or had no existence, the pressure became crushing. Families could fall into debt. Land could be lost. The cycle of poverty was hard to break. This reality of economics shaped the later teaching of Jesus. He spoke with frequency about debt and forgiveness. He told parables about workers in vineyards, about tenants and landowners, about the danger associated with wealth. These were not lessons in the abstract. They reflected the lived experience of people in villages such as Nazareth. The kingdom of God that Jesus proclaimed had implications of an economic nature. When he spoke of the last being first, he addressed an actual social order where the poor struggled beneath the weight of taxes and debt. When he said, "You cannot serve both God and money," he spoke to people who grasped the crushing power of forces that were economic. The economy of subsistence in Nazareth was precarious. Harvests that were good brought enough. Harvests that were bad brought hunger. The margin between survival and disaster was thin. This precarity gave birth to both anxiety and faith. Anxiety about having enough, faith in the provision of God. Jesus would in later times tell those who followed him not to worry about what they would eat or wear. He spoke as one who had lived in a world where such worry was constant and rational. The work itself had dignity. Paul would in later times write that those who do not work should not eat. This was not morality of a harsh kind, but reality of an economic kind in communities such as Nazareth. Everyone who possessed the ability to work had to work. There was no surplus to provide support for the idle. Labor was honorable, because labor was necessary. Jesus worked with his hands for the majority of his life. The years of public ministry were brief when compared to the years of labor in Nazareth. He knew the satisfaction that came from a doorframe that was well made. He knew the frustration associated with wood that split in the wrong way. He knew the exhaustion at the end of a day that was long. When he called disciples away from their nets and their tax booths, he called them away from the same kind of work he had done himself. The economy of Nazareth was the economy of ordinary people attempting to survive in a world that extracted more than it gave in return. It was the economy of subsistence, where labor and land and community held life together. Understanding this economy helps us understand the man who grew up within it and the message he would eventually proclaim. The boy Jesus in Nazareth, education, faith, and signs of what was to come. A Jewish boy in Nazareth had his education begin early. The foundation was Torah. The law given to Moses formed the core of identity for the Jewish people. To have knowledge of Torah was to have knowledge of who you were and whose you were. Education wasn't optional in nature. It was essential to maintaining faithfulness to the covenant. The primary teacher was the Father. Joseph would have taught Jesus the prayers that marked the day. The Shema recited morning and evening, declaring the Lord alone as God. The blessings over food and wine, the Psalms. These prayers gave shape to the rhythm of life. They created connection between the mundane and the sacred. As Jesus grew to sufficient age, he would have attended the school of the synagogue. The synagogue in Nazareth functioned as both gathering place for Sabbath worship and school during the week. The Hazan, the attendant of the synagogue, often functioned as teacher. Boys gained the ability to read Hebrew, the sacred language of Scripture, even though they spoke Aramaic at home. The method was memorization. The boys recited texts until they were written upon their hearts. They began with the Torah, the first 5 books, then the prophets, then the writings. The Jewish scriptures became part of the furniture of their minds. Phrases and verses were always ready, available for meditation and application. Jesus learned well. This becomes evident from the gospel accounts of his ministry. He quoted scripture with constancy. He interpreted it with authority. He engaged in debate with scribes and Pharisees who had spent their entire lives in study of Torah. His knowledge was deep, and his understanding was profound. This foundation received its laying in Nazareth. The education wasn't merely intellectual in nature, it was formational. The goal wasn't simply to have knowledge of what Torah said, but to live in accordance with its commands. The boys learned how to observe Sabbath, how to maintain purity, how to offer prayers, how to treat neighbors. The law was meant to be lived. The synagogue also gave shape to corporate identity. On Sabbath, the community came together. The scrolls were brought out, passages received their reading. They were translated from Hebrew into Aramaic, for those who did not have understanding of the sacred tongue. They were interpreted and applied. Questions underwent discussion. The congregation took part in the process of understanding what God required. Jesus would have attended these gatherings from the time of childhood. He heard the prophets read and explained. He heard the promises of a deliverer who was coming. He heard the laments over exile and oppression. He heard the calls to justice and mercy. The prophetic tradition saturated his consciousness. Beyond the formal education, Jesus learned from life on a daily basis. The parables he would in later times tell drew upon what he observed. Farmers scattering seed, women kneading dough, shepherds searching for sheep that were lost, children playing in the marketplace. These images came from Nazareth. The ordinary became the vocabulary for speaking about the kingdom of God. The religious calendar gave shape to the year. The festivals were not merely commemorations. They were remembrances with participation. At Passover, families retold the story of the Exodus as if they themselves had been the ones freed from Egypt. At Tabernacles, they lived in shelters of a temporary kind to recall the wandering in the wilderness. The past became present. The story became their own story. Luke makes record of one event from the childhood of Jesus that breaks the silence of the hidden years. When Jesus was 12 years old, his family traveled to Jerusalem for Passover. This was likely not his first pilgrimage, but it held significance. At 12, a Jewish boy was approaching adulthood. Soon he would bear responsibility for keeping the law himself. The family made the journey with others from Nazareth. The pilgrimage was communal in nature. They walked for days, covering the roughly 80 miles from Galilee to Jerusalem. As they walked, they sang the Psalms of Ascent. These were the songs pilgrims had sung for centuries. The journey was as much about anticipation as it was about arrival. Jerusalem during Passover was crowded. Pilgrims from throughout Judea, Galilee, and the diaspora packed the city. The temple held dominance over the skyline. The courts bustled with activity. Sacrifices were offered. Prayers were lifted. The presence of God felt close in that place. After the festival, Mary and Joseph began the journey home. They made the assumption that Jesus was somewhere within the group of travelers. A day's journey out, they came to the realization that he was not with them. Panic set in. They made their return to Jerusalem. For 3 days they searched. Finally, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening and asking questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. This detail holds importance. Jesus was not merely listening. He was engaging. He was already demonstrating the quality of understanding that would give character to his ministry. The boy from Nazareth held his own with the learned men of Jerusalem. Mary's response was natural. "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." The answer Jesus gave revealed something profound about his understanding of himself. "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" The distinction was clear. Joseph was not his father in the ultimate sense. God was. The house in Nazareth was not his true home. The temple, the dwelling place of God's presence, was where he belonged. At 12 years old, Jesus already had understanding of his unique relationship to God. Luke adds that Mary and Joseph did not have understanding of what he meant. This is telling. Even those closest to him, even his mother, who had received the announcement from the angel, could not fully grasp who he was. The mystery would unfold at a slow pace. Jesus made his return with them to Nazareth. Luke says he was obedient to them. The remarkable child submitted to ordinary parental authority. He went back to the rhythms belonging to village life. The learning went on. The work in carpentry went on. The observances of Sabbath went on. But something had received its revelation, a glimpse of the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. Luke summarizes the years that followed with a sentence that is single. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people. He matured in physical ways, in intellectual ways, in social ways, and in spiritual ways. The development was holistic in nature. The incarnation meant experiencing human growth in all of its dimensions. The education Jesus received in Nazareth provided him with equipment for his mission, the deep knowledge of Scripture, the understanding of Jewish faith and practice, the experience of ordinary life among ordinary people, the awareness of his unique identity as the Son of God. All of these elements were woven together in the hidden years. When Jesus finally emerged from Nazareth to begin his public ministry, he was fully prepared. The preparation took place in obscurity. The teacher received his shaping in silence. The prophet received his forming in a forgotten village. Nothing was accidental. Everything was providential. Nazareth was the school where the Messiah learned what it meant to be human, the launching pad, the baptism and temptation of Jesus from a Nazarene perspective. The young man who walked the dusty road from Nazareth to the Jordan River carried 30 years of that village with him. Every lesson learned in the workshop of Joseph, every Sabbath in the synagogue, every prayer whispered beneath the Galilean stars. The hidden years were about to give way to public ministry, but Nazareth remained woven into the fabric of who he was. The Gospel of Mark opens with striking abruptness. No story of birth, no tales of childhood, just a statement that is simple. Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee to be baptized by John. This detail holds more importance than it first seems to. Mark makes the choice to identify Jesus not by his lineage or his miraculous birth, but by his hometown, the Nazarene, the man from that place. At the Jordan, Jesus joined crowds of penitent Jews seeking ritual cleansing, farmers and fishermen, tax collectors and soldiers, all confessing their failures and holding hope for renewal. The ritual itself would have been familiar to someone raised in a home that was devout and Jewish. Mikvahs, or ritual baths, were common in first-century Jewish life. Archaeological excavations throughout Galilee have brought to light numerous examples of these stepped pools used for ceremonial washing. But something different took place when Jesus entered those waters. The heavens tore open. The Spirit descended in the manner of a dove. A voice spoke words that would define everything that followed. "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." These words carried weight that echoed through the Torah. They combined phrases from Psalm 2, a psalm of royal coronation, and Isaiah 42, the first servant's song. The carpenter from Nazareth was being declared both king and suffering servant, both roles that would have seemed impossible for someone from such humble origins. The Spirit that descended on Jesus immediately drove him into the wilderness, not a gentle leading. The Greek word is ekbalo, which means to cast out or expel with force, the same word used for driving out demons. After 30 years of quiet preparation in Nazareth, the mission began not with triumph, but with testing. For 40 days, Jesus fasted in the barren places east of the Jordan. The number itself had resonance with Jewish memory. 40 years wandering in the wilderness, 40 days Moses spent on Mount Sinai, 40 days Elijah traveled to Mount Horeb. Each period was a time of testing, refinement, and encounter with God. The temptations that came had focus on identity and method. The strategy of Satan was subtle. He didn't raise questions about whether Jesus was the Son of God. He raised questions about what that meant and how it should be lived out. If you are the Son of God, turn stones to bread. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself from the temple." The underlying question was always the same. Will you trust the way of the Father or take shortcuts to glory? Each temptation offered an alternative that was plausible to the path of suffering. Provide for physical needs through miracle. Prove divine favor through spectacle. Gain worldly power through compromise. These weren't suggestions that were absurd. They were paths that were reasonable that any Messiah might consider. Jesus answered each temptation with Scripture, specifically with passages from Deuteronomy 6-8, texts that described the testing of the Hebrew people in their wilderness wandering. Where they failed, Jesus succeeded. Where they grumbled and doubted, Jesus trusted. The parallel was deliberate. The Son was reliving the story of the sons, but writing an ending that was different. The setting of these temptations holds importance. The Judean wilderness stands as a brutal, merciless expanse. Ancient waters carved rocky ground into wadis that run deep. Heat blazes before giving way to cold that cuts to the bone. This is terrain where staying alive means never letting down your guard. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, characterized this region as essentially empty of inhabitants, serving as a haven for those who broke laws and those who sought solitude. After the period of testing concluded, angels arrived and attended to Jesus. The Greek term employed here is diakoneo, which conveys the meaning of serving or caring for someone's requirements. This identical word would later appear in descriptions of the women who provided support for Jesus' work. This same word Jesus himself would employ when describing his purpose. The Son of Man did not come to receive service, but rather to give it. This sequence gains deeper meaning when we examine what followed Jesus' time in the wilderness. He didn't immediately return to Nazareth. Rather, he started bringing together followers and delivering teachings in the synagogues scattered throughout Galilee. Reports of his wisdom and the authority he carried spread quickly through the web of small villages peppering the landscape. Studies of 1st century Galilee through archaeological methods show us a thick concentration of modest farming communities, the majority housing fewer than 500 souls. Information moved fast in environments like these. A teacher who performed extraordinary signs and spoke with remarkable authority would have dominated every conversation at markets and gathering places around wells. However, the question that would shadow Jesus through his entire ministry had already taken root. Could the Messiah genuinely emerge from Nazareth? Could the Son of God arise from a place so thoroughly ordinary? The wilderness testing provided that answer with unmistakable force. Being called by God has nothing to do with having impressive beginnings. It rests entirely on remaining faithful through obedience. The gap between Jesus' modest background and his universal purpose wasn't some mistake. It stood at the very center of what he came to reveal. God's reign doesn't arrive with the grandeur and ceremony that people anticipate. It comes without fanfare in forgotten villages, through sons of carpenters who place their trust in the Father, even when that trust leads straight through desolation and trial. Every challenge Jesus encountered during those 40 days would resurface across his ministry. The pull to demonstrate himself through spectacular displays. The weight of pressure to offer material fixes to problems of the spirit. The promise of authority without walking the road of pain. Each time, he would select the more difficult path, the path that led through being cast aside, being misunderstood, and finally dying the death reserved for criminals. The baptism and the temptation weren't merely personal episodes in Jesus' life. They served as his formal appointment as the authentic representative of God's chosen people. Where Adam stumbled in a garden, Jesus prevailed in barren land. Where the Hebrew people grumbled after departing Egypt, Jesus maintained trust after leaving Nazareth. The second Adam was demonstrating faithfulness precisely where the first one had collapsed. For the residents of Nazareth, watching someone from their own community rise to prominence must have triggered complicated feelings. Certainly pride, but also bewilderment and likely doubt. They had witnessed him as a boy. They had observed him laboring next to Joseph. How could this person they knew so well now make claims to divine authority? That tension would shortly escalate to a crisis point when Jesus came back to deliver teaching in the synagogue of his hometown. The place that launched him was preparing to become a war zone, being turned away in his home village. The confrontation in the synagogue. The day Jesus came back to teach in the Nazareth synagogue should have been a moment of celebration. The local son who made it, the carpenter's boy who had risen to become a celebrated teacher across Galilee, was returning home. Instead, it transformed into one of the most brutal rejections the Gospels record. Luke's account of this gospel gives us the most thorough description of what transpired. Jesus walked into the synagogue on the Sabbath, which had been his regular practice. That phrase carries weight because it demonstrates continuity. Even while traveling as a teacher, Jesus kept the patterns of Jewish worship that had shaped him from his earliest days. The synagogue wasn't simply a structure. It functioned as the pulsing center of Jewish community existence in villages the size of Nazareth. What archaeologists have uncovered from first-century Galilean synagogues points to unpretentious buildings, frequently converted structures, or straightforward rectangular spaces with benches of stone running along the walls. The Nazareth synagogue would have felt close and personal, capable of accommodating maybe 50 to 100 individuals at the very most. Every person there would have had personal knowledge of Jesus. They had witnessed his growth. The scroll that was given to Jesus that day held the words of the prophet Isaiah. Whether this represented the assigned portion for that day or a purposeful selection remains uncertain from Luke's narrative. What carries significance is the passage Jesus selected to read. "The Spirit of the Lord rests upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to those who are poor." The text goes on with assurances of liberation for those held captive, vision restored to those without sight, and freedom granted to those suffering under oppression. These words, drawn from Isaiah chapter 61, had been understood for ages as prophecy pointing to the Messiah. They paint a picture of the coming era when God would bring restoration to his people and make justice a reality. Every Jewish person listening would have grasped the weight these promises carried. Jesus rolled the scroll back up, returned it to the attendant, and took his seat. Every eye locked on him. The position he took mattered. Teachers would sit when giving instruction that carried authority. Those learning and those listening would stand or take positions on the ground. Through the act of sitting, Jesus was asserting the position of one who interprets, someone possessing the right to unfold the meaning of the text. His next words exploded like a bomb in that confined space. "Today, this scripture has reached its fulfillment in your hearing, not in some future time, not at some point far down the road. Today, in this very moment, inside this ordinary village synagogue, through this son of a carpenter." The assertion was breathtaking in how bold it was. Initially, the crowd's reaction leaned positive. Luke tells us they responded favorably and expressed amazement at the gracious language flowing from his mouth. Yet underneath the surface wonder sat a disturbing question. Isn't this the son of Joseph? That question exposes the heart of their internal conflict. They had knowledge of his family. They had knowledge of his trade. They held memories of him as a child moving through the dusty streets of Nazareth. How could someone this familiar, this unremarkable, lay claim to fulfilling ancient prophecy? The social tension was sharp as a blade. Small communities run on collective memory and fixed social structures. When someone steps beyond their designated position, it threatens the whole social framework. Jesus perceived their doubt before they gave it voice. He understood their thoughts. "Physician, make yourself well." The saying carried a meaning along the lines of, "Demonstrate your power here first." They had received news of miraculous acts in Capernaum and other towns throughout Galilee. If Jesus genuinely held divine power, why wouldn't he prove it in the place he came from? Why should people who were strangers receive signs while those from his own community received nothing? Yet Jesus declined to follow their expectations. Instead, he directed attention to troubling precedents from Scripture. During Elijah's time, numerous widows resided in the northern kingdom while a terrible famine ravaged the land. Yet Elijah received instructions to go to none of them, only to a widow living outside their borders in Zarephath. In the time of Elisha, many people suffered from leprosy throughout the land. Yet only Naaman, who came from Syria, received healing. The message couldn't be missed. God's grace frequently moves beyond anticipated borders. Divine blessing doesn't fall automatically on people who assume they merit it because of their heritage or their closeness. The prophets in their own time had brought help to foreigners while their fellow countrymen stayed unblessed. This proved too much to bear. What started as wonder transformed into fury. The whole synagogue erupted in anger. They grabbed hold of Jesus and forced him toward the edge of the hill where their town had been constructed. Their purpose was evident. They intended to hurl him off the cliff. The landscape here carries importance. Nazareth occupies a basin with hills rising around it. Multiple spots surrounding the town feature steep descents that match what Luke describes. Archaeological work in the area indicates the most probable location is a limestone cliff face on the southeastern boundary of the ancient settlement, where the fall measures 30 to 40 meters. What took place next remains shrouded in mystery. Luke simply reports that Jesus moved through the crowd and departed. Some have put forward the idea that the mob's rage simply burned itself out. Others have suggested divine involvement, perhaps rendering Jesus unrecognizable or generating confusion among them. The text offers no explanation. It merely states that the one they attempted to kill walked away without harm. The rejection that occurred in Nazareth wasn't arbitrary violence. It grew from particular cultural and psychological elements. Honor and shame ruled Mediterranean culture in the first century. A person's value got determined primarily by how others perceived them publicly. For anyone to assert exceptional status without possessing the proper credentials or showing demonstrations of power was viewed as disgraceful arrogance. Jesus had broken these unspoken conventions. He laid claim to prophetic authority without first proving himself to the people who had the longest knowledge of him. He implied that those considered outsiders might obtain God's blessing while those on the inside continued in their state of need. He threw into question their assumptions regarding how divine favor functions. There exists also what researchers in sociology term the prophet's paradox. Familiarity creates contempt, particularly when someone emerging from within the community makes claims to special standing. The very closeness that should have provided Jesus with credibility turned into the barrier preventing belief. They found themselves unable to bring together the exceptional claims with the ordinary individual they believed they understood. Mark's version of this event from a parallel perspective includes a detail full of sadness. A prophet receives honor everywhere, except in his own hometown, among his own relatives, and within his own household. The rejection extended past the broader community. It encompassed family. The very people who should have stood as his most devoted supporters found the greatest difficulty in accepting his calling. This event represented a crucial turning point. Jesus would go on teaching throughout Galilee, yet Nazareth disappears from the gospel stories following this moment. The village that formed him became the village that turned him away. The launching pad transformed into a door that closed. Still, even within rejection, purpose remained. The confrontation in Nazareth brought to light the pattern that would characterize Jesus' whole ministry. Those who were expected to accept him would turn him down. Those considered outsiders would welcome him. Those in first place would find themselves last. Those in last place would move to first. The kingdom of God operated according to logic different from human kingdoms. The wounds from that rejection probably remained for both Jesus and the community for a long time. Small villages carry long memories. The day they attempted to throw the carpenter's son from a cliff would have been recounted again and again, woven into the fabric of Nazareth's story. Some likely felt their actions were justified. Others perhaps carried quiet feelings of regret. What stands certain is that Nazareth's turning away of Jesus became representative of a larger reality. Divine revelation frequently arrives in forms we don't expect, from locations we don't hold in esteem, through individuals we think we already comprehend. The test is whether we possess the ability to look beyond our preconceptions to recognize God working in ways that surprise us. The boy from Nazareth had returned home, and home had sent him away. Can anything of value come from Nazareth? The reputation of the town. The question lingers in the atmosphere like smoke hanging in the air. Nathanael posed it when Philip informed him they had discovered the Messiah, Jesus from Nazareth, Joseph's son. The reply came immediately, almost like a reflex. Can anything of value emerge from Nazareth? This single statement, captured in John's Gospel, speaks volumes regarding how people in the first century viewed this small Galilean village. The question didn't spring from curiosity. It came from dismissal. The mere notion that someone originating from Nazareth could be the promised deliverer appeared ridiculous. However, what caused Nazareth to become such a target of contempt? Why did its name turn into shorthand for being insignificant? Geography offers the initial hint. Nazareth occupied a tucked-away position in a valley within Lower Galilee, distant from major travel routes and centers of population. Unlike Sepphoris, the gleaming capital located just an hour's journey to the north, or Tiberias positioned on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, Nazareth brought nothing of political, economic, or strategic worth. It received no mention in the Hebrew Scriptures. It failed to appear in the extensive catalogues Josephus compiled of Galilean settlements. For the majority of the ancient world, it held no existence whatsoever. Estimates of population for first-century Nazareth fall somewhere between 100 and 400 inhabitants. Archaeological examination of the region brings to light a grouping of modest homes carved into hillsides of limestone, encircled by terraces built for agriculture. The village maintained itself through farming for survival and small-scale work in crafts. Nothing beyond that. Nothing that would impress. Consider this in comparison to cities referenced with pride within Jewish tradition. Jerusalem, the city held sacred, site of the temple, focal point of Jewish worship. Bethlehem, despite being small, held claim to fame as the birthplace of David. Hebron contained the burial places of the patriarchs. These locations carried significance in Jewish awareness. Nazareth carried absolutely none. The wider context of Galilee made matters more complicated still. Galilee as a region faced suspicion from Judeans living in the south. The territory had existed separately from Judea across centuries, developing dialect and customs of its own. When Galilee underwent forced incorporation into the Jewish state under the Hasmonean dynasty during the late 2nd century before Christ, the reunion was more political in nature than cultural. Judeans regarded Galileans as unsophisticated at the most generous assessment and questionable at worst. The Talmud contains preserved sayings that ridicule Galilean patterns of speech and lack of religious strictness. The charge that Galileans lacked ability to distinguish between particular guttural sounds in Hebrew shows up multiple times within rabbinic writings. This difference in language would later expose Peter in the courtyard of the high priest when his accent marked him as a follower of the one from Galilee. The mixed population of Galilee contributed additional fuel to southern suspicions. Gentile cities marked the landscape with their presence. Greek culture had achieved deep penetration, especially within urban centers. The level of Jewish observance showed wide variation across the territory. For Judeans who practiced strict adherence, this diversity bred contamination. Authentic faith required keeping separate, and Galileans showed too much willingness to intermingle. Within Galilee itself, hierarchies existed. Sepphoris and Tiberias functioned as cosmopolitan centers featuring paved streets, public structures, and administrative significance. Towns such as Capernaum and Chorazin sat positioned on crucial trade routes, drawing benefit from commercial movement. Nazareth enjoyed none of these benefits. Even among the overlooked, it stood as the most overlooked. The name itself provides no assistance. Unlike numerous biblical place names carrying clear meanings, Nazareth resists straightforward explanation. Some who study these matters suggest it derives from a Hebrew root signifying branch or shoot, which would create an intriguing connection to messianic prophecies regarding a branch from Jesse's root. Others put forward connections to words indicating watch or guard. The uncertainty surrounding even the origin of the name mirrors the town's state of obscurity. Nathanael's question assumes sharper meaning within this context. He wasn't merely voicing prejudice based on geography. He was articulating the conventional wisdom prevailing in his time. Messiahs don't emerge from nowhere. They come forth from places that carry importance, bearing the weight of sacred history. Nazareth possessed no such weight. It was, by every measure available, insignificant. The writers of the New Testament clearly understood this problem. Matthew's Gospel labors to establish Jesus' connection to Bethlehem, David's city. Luke follows the same approach, taking care to explain how someone known as a Nazarene could lay claim to descent from David. John begins with a cosmic introduction that establishes Jesus' origin before any mention of his earthly hometown. The writers recognized they faced a challenge to credibility. Roman sources from that period ignore Nazareth in its entirety. The town existed as too small, too poor, too removed from events that held importance for those chronicling imperial affairs. Even when Christianity started its spread through the empire in later decades, Nazareth itself stayed insignificant. Those making pilgrimages sought Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and eventually locations around the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth would need to wait for centuries before becoming a place people traveled to see. This state of obscurity generated problems for early Christian defenders of the faith. Critics such as Celsus during the 2nd century mocked the origins of Jesus. How could anyone from a backwater make claims to universal authority? The charge carried sting because it touched on truth. According to every standard measure of importance, Nazareth brought nothing that would recommend it. Yet the Gospel writers never attempted to deny or downplay this reality. They leaned directly into it. John's narrative shows Philip responding to Nathanael's skepticism not through arguments, but through an invitation. Come and observe for yourself. The proof wouldn't be discovered in Nazareth's lineage. It would be discovered in the person himself. The theme runs throughout the Gospels. God's kingdom turns human expectations upside down. Those in first place move to last. Those who are exalted find themselves brought low. Those who are weak bring shame to the strong. A Messiah emerging from Nazareth fits this pattern with perfection. The very element that appears to disqualify him becomes proof of divine logic at work. Paul would later articulate this theological move with explicitness in his letters. God made the choice of what appears foolish to bring shame to the wise. God made the choice of what appears weak to bring shame to the strong. God made the choice of what is low and held in contempt to reduce to nothing the things that are. The incarnation occurring in Nazareth gave body to this principle. Still, the practical challenge stayed in place. Early Christian missionaries faced the necessity of overcoming the stigma. Jewish audiences in particular wrestled with it. The Messiah was supposed to arrive in power and glory, bringing restoration to David's throne. Instead, they received the message that he came from a village so insignificant that most Jews had never even heard of it. The Romans encountered different objections. They looked upon provincial origins with contempt. Anyone making claims to divine status should originate from Rome, or at minimum, Athens or Alexandria. Nazareth didn't even qualify as a proper city according to Roman standards. It amounted to a cluster of peasant dwellings, the sort of place imperial citizens would move through without taking notice. These objections never went away. They underwent absorption into the Christian narrative as features rather than flaws. The humility of the incarnation transformed into a point for promotion. God didn't arrive as a conquering emperor. He arrived as a carpenter from a village of no account. The shock of it formed the very point. Archaeological work conducted in Nazareth across the past century has provided confirmation of the ancient sources. This was indeed a tiny settlement, barely capable of being distinguished from dozens of other agricultural villages scattered through the region. Excavations have brought to light modest homes, installations for agriculture, and evidence pointing to existence at subsistence level. Nothing indicates wealth, importance, or influence. One discovery stands apart from the rest. A stone inscription from the 3rd or 4th century listing priestly assignments to various towns. Nazareth makes an appearance on this list, providing confirmation of its existence and its Jewish character. Yet the very fact that such a late inscription proved necessary speaks volumes. Nazareth required remembering and recording because it was so easily subject to being forgotten. The question Nathanael asked has continued echoing across 2,000 years. Can anything of value come from Nazareth? The Christian response is that the most valuable thing that ever existed came from Nazareth. The very obscurity that caused the claim to seem absurd transformed into evidence of its truthfulness. God doesn't follow human rules. He has no need for impressive credentials or important addresses. The carpenter from the forgotten village grew to become the most influential person in all of human history. Nazareth, the town whose name meant insignificance, lent its name to the followers who were Nazarenes, the brothers and sisters of Jesus. Growing up alongside someone who would subsequently claim to be God's son must have been complicated. The Gospels provide us glimpses into the family life of Jesus, and the picture that takes shape is anything but simple. He had brothers named James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. He had sisters who remain unnamed in the texts. They all shared life together in that small Nazareth home, sharing meals and chores and the rhythms that defined village life. Yet at some point along the way, a divide opened up. The family that should have provided his strongest support transformed into his doubters. Mark's gospel preserves a moment that causes discomfort. Jesus was engaged in teaching, drawing crowds so large that he couldn't find time to eat. When his family received word about this, they went to take hold of him, declaring, "He has lost his mind." The Greek phrase carries even stronger force. They held the belief that he had lost his senses, become possessed, or gone mad. This wasn't gentle concern. This was intervention. His family believed something had gone terribly wrong, that Jesus needed to be brought back home and restrained before he brought further embarrassment on himself and on them. The shame attached to having a family member behave strangely in public would have cut deep in first-century village culture. Later, within the same chapter, his mother and brothers made their appearance, calling to him from outside the house where he was engaged in teaching. When someone informed Jesus that his family was waiting, his response must have cut to the core. "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Then, directing his gaze toward those seated in a circle around him, he declared, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever carries out the will of God, that person is my brother and sister and mother." The statement redrew the definition of family around shared purpose rather than shared blood. For his biological family standing on the outside, hearing this filtered through others, the rejection must have inflicted pain. John's Gospel contributes another detail. During the Feast of Tabernacles, the brothers of Jesus pressed him to travel to Judea and make himself known publicly. No one operates in secret if they seek to be recognized openly. If you're doing these things, reveal yourself to the world. The narrator includes a crucial observation, for not even his brothers placed belief in him. The psychology at work here proves revealing. They acknowledged that Jesus was accomplishing remarkable things, yet they didn't accept his claims regarding his identity. The gap between what they observed him doing and what he declared about himself generated cognitive dissonance. He performed signs, certainly, but the Messiah, the Son of God, that appeared to be insanity. James emerges among the brothers as carrying particular significance. The New Testament letter that carries his name identifies him as a servant of Jesus Christ, yet makes no reference to their biological relationship. This silence speaks with volume. James didn't assert authority founded on being Jesus' brother. He claimed it founded on being Jesus' servant. What brought about the change? What transformed James from skeptic into leader? Paul supplies the crucial detail. In the list he provides of resurrection appearances in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he makes mention that the risen Jesus appeared to James in a specific encounter. This private meeting receives no recording in the Gospels, yet its impact ran profound. The brother who once believed Jesus was deranged became the pillar of the Jerusalem church. Acts presents James as a central figure within the early Christian community. When Peter needed to provide explanation for his ministry to Gentiles, he delivered his report to James. When Paul traveled to Jerusalem, he arranged meeting with James. When the church encountered its first major dispute regarding the inclusion of Gentiles, James gave the decisive speech. The carpenter's brother had transformed into the movement's anchor. The transformation wasn't merely personal in nature, it was theological. James faced the necessity of reconciling everything he thought he understood about his brother with the impossible claim of resurrection. He had grown up alongside Jesus. He held knowledge of Jesus' childhood, his peculiar traits, his humanity. To accept that this identical person was Lord demanded a complete restructuring of reality. Josephus, writing later during the 1st century, makes mention of the death of James. Around the year 62 AD, during a period when power stood vacant in Jerusalem, the high priest Ananus had James executed by stoning as someone who broke the law. Josephus describes James as the brother of Jesus who received the designation of Christ, confirming both the relationship and Jesus' messianic identification from a source outside the faith. Another brother, Judas, who also carried the name Jude, composed the brief epistle that bears his name. Like James, he identifies himself as a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Once again, the biological connection to Jesus receives no mention. What held importance wasn't kinship, but rather discipleship. The letter of Jude addresses false teachers who had worked their way into the church. His tone carries fierceness, remaining uncompromising. He draws quotes from ancient texts and advances bold theological claims. This was no longer the skeptical brother standing outside the house in Nazareth. This was a defender of the faith, prepared to fight for the message his brother had proclaimed. Early church tradition maintains that several of Jesus' brothers took on roles as missionaries. Hegesippus, a Christian writer from the 2nd century, makes the claim that relatives of Jesus underwent examination by Roman authorities due to their Davidic ancestry. The grandsons of Judas made appearance before Emperor Domitian, yet received release when they demonstrated themselves to be simple farmers rather than political threats. The fact that the family of Jesus became recognized as leaders of the Nazarene sect carries striking significance. Within Jewish culture, family authority typically passed to the eldest son, yet James wasn't the eldest. Jesus was. Still, following the resurrection, James received leadership inheritance. The movement one brother founded received sustaining from another. This generated an interesting dynamic within early Christianity. The Nazarene Church in Jerusalem, under James's leadership, maintained Jewish expression of the faith. They continued Torah observance, participated in worship at the temple, and viewed themselves as a renewal movement operating within Judaism. Meanwhile, Paul and others were bringing the message to Gentiles, establishing communities that appeared quite different. The tension between these approaches rises to the surface throughout Acts and throughout Paul's letters. How much of Jewish law should Gentile converts be expected to follow? Could Jews and Gentiles share meals together? The council described in Acts chapter 15, where James played a decisive part, took up these questions. The compromise that emerged reflected the wisdom and authority James carried. Archaeological evidence from Jerusalem includes bone boxes from the 1st century. One, brought to light in 1953, carries the inscription, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Questions regarding the authenticity of this particular artifact have been raised in debate, with concerns about whether the final phrase might represent a later addition. Yet it reflects the historical reality that the family of Jesus was known and held in memory within the Jerusalem community. The Nazarenes, as they received designation, remained a distinct group operating within Christianity for multiple centuries. The term applied specifically to Jewish Christians who maintained Torah observance while placing belief in Jesus as Messiah. Church fathers such as Jerome made mention of them, sometimes with criticism, as maintaining practices that most Christians had left behind. Yet the original Nazarenes, the actual brothers and sisters of Jesus, encountered a unique challenge. They faced the necessity of bridging two identities that appeared incompatible. Jesus was their brother, someone they had engaged in arguments with, shared laughter with, and lived beside. He was also their Lord, someone who had achieved conquest over death, and now merited worship. The transformation of Jesus' siblings from skeptics into leaders stands as one of the most remarkable aspects within the early church narrative. People don't typically follow their brothers as divine figures. The fact that James, Judas, and the others did precisely that suggests something extraordinary took place. The resurrection wasn't merely a doctrine they gave acceptance to. It was an experience that shattered and rebuilt their understanding of reality. Mary, the mother of Jesus, makes occasional appearances in these narratives. After initially going to seize Jesus alongside his brothers, she later makes appearance among the disciples in the upper room, waiting for the Spirit at Pentecost. The mother who had stored up mysterious things in her heart now observed as those mysteries unfolded in ways she couldn't have constructed in imagination. The Nazareth family that once found difficulty in understanding Jesus became the Jerusalem community that made proclamation about him. The brothers who once stood on the outside calling to him now stood as pillars within his church. The transformation reached completion, not because they set aside their skepticism with ease, but because they encountered something that couldn't receive explanation away. James would meet his death in Jerusalem, stoned because of his faith. Judas would compose warnings regarding false teachers bringing threat to the church. The sisters remain without names in history, though tradition suggests some became followers as well. The family from Nazareth, scattered through mission and through martyrdom, left behind a legacy that outlasted them. They provided proof that knowing Jesus on a personal level didn't automatically translate to understanding him. They demonstrated that even those possessing the closest proximity to him faced the necessity of making a choice regarding who he was. And they showed that when that choice receives making, it changes everything. The skeptical brothers transformed into faithful servants. The hometown lost its relevance. The message became all that held importance. The archaeology of Nazareth, bringing to light the hometown of Jesus. The ground lying beneath Nazareth holds secrets that have required centuries to bring into view. Unlike Jerusalem, which has maintained continuous habitation and veneration across millennia, Nazareth stayed largely undeveloped until modern times. This obscurity transformed into an archaeological gift when excavations finally commenced in earnest. They brought to light a remarkably intact picture of a first-century Galilean village. The first serious archaeological work in Nazareth had its beginning in 1955 when the Franciscan Custody of the Holy Land undertook excavations beneath the Church of the Annunciation. What they discovered validated the gospel accounts while adding complexity to our romantic notions regarding the place. The remains brought to light a tiny agricultural hamlet carved into hillsides of limestone. Houses from the era of Jesus were discovered cut directly into the rock, following the natural contours the terrain presented. These weren't freestanding structures composed of wood and stone. They were cave-like dwellings featuring a single entrance, expanded caves that occurred naturally, or carved spaces in the soft limestone. One structure commands attention. Beneath the Church of the Annunciation, archaeologists brought to light a complex of rooms centered on a grotto or cave. Christian inscriptions from the Byzantine era cover the walls, including the Greek phrase, Hail Mary, and references to a Christian place of worship. The veneration clearly traces back centuries before the current church received construction. Whether this specific site served as Mary's home stays subject to debate. What stands clear is that Christians during the Byzantine period held belief that it was, and they constructed successive churches over the spot to mark it. The layers of construction tell a story of continuous reverence. The current basilica, which reached completion in 1969, represents the fifth church built on this location, near the Church of St. Joseph. Additional domestic structures came forth during excavations in the 20th century. These include silos for grain, cisterns for storing water, and presses for oil carved into bedrock. The archaeological picture reveals a community focused on processing products from agriculture, particularly olives and grain. One home, assigned a date to the late Hellenistic or early Roman period, included a courtyard featuring storage areas and living spaces arranged in surrounding fashion. The construction is simple in character: stone walls left undressed, floors of packed earth, and roofs that would have been constructed from wooden beams covered with clay and thatch. These weren't elegant homes. They were functional shelters, constructed by people possessing limited resources. The limestone terrain of Nazareth made this style of architecture practical in nature, soft enough to allow carving, yet stable enough to generate lasting structures. The rock provided both building material and the buildings in and of themselves. Families would expand their living space through digging deeper into the hillside as children received birth and needs increased in size. In 2009, excavations conducted ahead of construction for a visitors center produced a remarkable discovery. Archaeologists brought to light a first-century house beneath what had existed as a courtyard. The structure included walls composed of stone and mud brick, a courtyard featuring a cistern, and multiple rooms with doors hewn from stone. Most significantly, the building style and artifacts received dating firmly to the time of Jesus. This discovery generated headlines as the house where Jesus experienced growth. Such claims extend beyond what archaeology possesses the ability to prove, yet what the site does demonstrate is what typical housing appeared like in Nazareth during the first century. Whether Jesus resided in this specific house, or one essentially identical to it, carries less importance than understanding the environment that brought shape to him. The artifacts discovered in domestic contexts throughout Nazareth tell their own story. Pottery fragments include jars for storage, pots for cooking, and lamps for oil typical of Jewish households in the period. Stone vessels, preferred by Jews for their advantages regarding ritual purity over pottery, make frequent appearance. Whoever lived here maintained Jewish religious customs. What receives absence proves equally telling. No floors of mosaic, no walls bearing frescoes, no imported fine pottery or goods of luxury. The material culture reflects existence at subsistence level, families producing the majority of what they required needs and engaging in trade locally for the rest. A tomb complex on the hillside located to the northeast of the village center has been subject to knowledge for centuries. Cut into the rock, it contains multiple burial chambers featuring graves of the coke type. These are horizontal shafts carved into chamber walls where bodies received laying. The style is distinctively Jewish in character and receives dating to the Roman period. The location of this tomb complex carries importance. Jewish law imposed requirements for burials outside areas where living occurred. The fact that these tombs occupy the position they do assists in establishing the boundaries of the first-century village. They mark the point where the settlement reached its end, and the burial ground had its beginning. In 1962, excavations at the Sisters of Nazareth convent brought to light additional remains from the first century. These included a rock-cut tomb that later underwent incorporation into a Byzantine church complex. Here, once again, the pattern makes its emergence. Early Christians identified specific locations as sites of holiness and constructed churches over them, generating layers of veneration. One of the most controversial archaeological finds connected to Nazareth arrived from Caesarea Maritima, not from Nazareth itself. A marble fragment receiving date to the 3rd or 4th century was brought to discovery in 1962. It contained an inscription in Hebrew listing the priestly courses and their assigned towns. Nazareth makes appearance on this list, assigned to the priestly course of Hapizez. This inscription, receiving knowledge as the Caesarea inscription, provides the first non-Christian archaeological evidence for the existence of Nazareth. Following the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, priestly families underwent dispersal to towns throughout Galilee. That Nazareth received one of these families provides confirmation it was a known Jewish settlement. Recent excavations in 2020 at the site of the planned Sisters of Nazareth Center brought to light more dwellings and installations for agriculture. The findings continue providing support for the picture of a small agricultural village housing a population in the low hundreds during the first century. One installation receiving identification as a wine or oil press featured a large basin of stone with channels for collecting liquid. The presence of multiple such installations suggests Nazareth held participation in regional agricultural trade, even if on a modest scale. Terrace systems carved into the hillsides surrounding Nazareth also received dating to the Roman period. These agricultural terraces brought maximization to arable land in the hilly terrain, allowing families to grow grains, olives, and grapes on slopes that would otherwise possess uselessness. The labor required to construct and maintain these terraces speaks to the industriousness held by Nazareth's inhabitants. Water supply poses challenges always in the limestone hills of Galilee. The ancient residents of Nazareth placed reliance on cisterns carved into bedrock to collect rainwater. One well, still receiving knowledge today as Mary's Well, has provided water since ancient times. Though the current structure receives dating to much later periods, the spring itself fed the village in the days of Jesus. The synagogue where Jesus would have engaged in study and later delivered teaching has not received conclusive identification. No remains of a first-century synagogue have been discovered in Nazareth, though this isn't surprising in nature. Early Galilean synagogues were frequently simple structures subject to easy destruction or construction over in subsequent centuries. The synagogue could have been a modest building or even a room in the home of someone. Archaeological surveys of the broader Nazareth basin brought to reveal that the village sat positioned among other small settlements, forming a cluster of Jewish communities in Lower Galilee. Jaffa, and other villages receiving mention in historical sources lay positioned within an hour's walk. This network of settlements would have engaged in sharing of resources, marriages, and news. The total area of first-century Nazareth receives estimation at approximately 4 hectares, roughly 10 acres. This tiny footprint brings alignment with population estimates of 200 to 400 people. The village would have been subject to traversing in minutes, every resident subject to knowing by every other resident. Critics have on occasion advanced claims that Nazareth didn't possess existence in the first century, that it received invention by gospel writers. Archaeological evidence provides decisive refutation of these claims. The pottery, the housing styles, the installations for agriculture, the tomb complexes, and the Caesarea inscription all provide confirmation of a modest Jewish settlement exactly where the Gospels declare Jesus experienced growth. What archaeology cannot provide is proof of any specific connection to Jesus or his family. No artifact declares Jesus was here. No inscription provides identification of Mary's house. The locations receiving veneration by Christian tradition may or may not possess accuracy. Yet what archaeology does provide is context, the material reality of life in a first-century Galilean village. The houses possessed smallness and darkness. The work possessed hardness and constancy. The diet possessed simplicity. The possessions were few in number. This was the environment that brought shape to the man who would bring reshaping to the world. The archaeology makes the humanity of Jesus more concrete in nature. He lived in actual rooms, possessing actual dimensions. He walked on actual floors of stone. He drank from actual cisterns. The challenge for modern pilgrims and scholars alike is maintaining hold together of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The archaeology reveals to us the ordinary with brutal clarity. This was a place poor, small, unremarkable in character, yet within that ordinariness, Christians hold belief that something extraordinary took place. God became human, and he accomplished it here, in rooms like these, among people who lived like this. Recent advances in technology have allowed archaeologists to conduct surveys of Nazareth without extensive excavation. Ground-penetrating radar and other techniques of non-invasive character reveal structures still subject to burial beneath the modern city. As Nazareth has grown, especially across the 20th and 21st centuries, development has both brought threat to and brought revelation of ancient remains. The tension between preservation and progress maintains continuance. Modern Nazareth functions as a bustling city of over 75,000 people, the majority of them Arab citizens. Ancient remains occupy positions beneath homes, shops, and streets. Each new project of construction generates potential for discovery and destruction alike. The churches constructed over traditional sites of holiness serve as both monuments and museums. They provide protection for the ancient remains lying beneath them, while advancing bold theological claims regarding those remains. Walking through the Church of the Annunciation, visitors encounter layers: the modern basilica, the Byzantine church, the Crusader church, and finally the rock-cut rooms of the Roman period. Each layer represents a different community's response of faith to the same story. Each generation constructed over the previous one, not to bring erasure, but to bring honor. The cumulative effect functions as a physical palimpsest, stories receiving writing on top of stories, all directing attention to events held in belief to have taken place in the limestone caves below. What makes emergence from the archaeology of Nazareth is a picture both humble and profound in character. This was not a location of kings or monuments. It was a location of farmers and craftsmen, of families maintaining survival on the margins of the Roman Empire. The grandeur would arrive later, constructed by believers directing gaze backward. Yet in the beginning, there existed just a village and a boy experiencing growth within it. The ground maintains yielding of secrets. Each excavation adds detail to our understanding. And through it all, the central question stays in place. How did this place produce the person who would bring transformation to human history? The archaeology provides us with the setting. The answer, if one exists, occupies position beyond what stones and pottery possess ability to tell. Beyond the Bible. Nazareth in early extra-biblical sources. For decades following the death of Jesus, Nazareth makes appearance nowhere outside Christian writings. The silence carries striking character. No Roman records make mention of it. Jewish sources give it no attention. The village remained beneath the notice of historians and those who keep chronicles. This absence has provided fuel for skeptics while generating puzzlement for believers. If Jesus possessed such significance, why didn't anyone compose writings about his hometown? The answer resides partly in the insignificance of Nazareth. Ancient writers directed focus towards cities possessing political, economic, or military importance. A village of 200 peasants in the Galilean hills brought nothing worthy of recording. The silence informs us not that Nazareth didn't possess existence, but that it didn't hold importance for anyone keeping records. The first reference to Nazareth outside Christian sources arrives from an unexpected source, an inscription discovered at Caesarea Maritima. Brought to discovery in 1962 during excavations of an ancient synagogue, this marble fragment receives dating to the 3rd or 4th century. Composed in Hebrew, it provides listing of the 24 priestly courses and the towns in Galilee where they underwent resettlement following the destruction of Jerusalem. The 18th course, Hapizez, received assignment to Nazareth. This simple administrative record provides confirmation of what Christians had been declaring for centuries. Nazareth possessed existence and received recognition as a Jewish settlement. The inscription carries importance because it arrives from a Jewish context, completely independent of Christian claims. Following the failed Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135 AD, Emperor Hadrian imposed prohibition on Jews from Jerusalem, the priestly families, guardians of temple traditions, even following the temple's destruction, underwent scattering throughout Galilee. That they would note which families went where makes sense in character. These records brought preservation of their heritage and organizational structure in exile. The fact that Nazareth received choosing as a destination for a priestly family suggests it was an established Jewish community, however small in size. Priestly families maintained strict requirements regarding purity. They wouldn't undergo relocation to places possessing questionable Jewish credentials. Julius Africanus, a Christian writer from the 3rd century, provides another early reference. In a letter addressed to Aristides, he engages in discussion regarding the genealogies of Jesus. Africanus states that relatives of Jesus called desposinoi, those belonging to the Master, lived in Jewish villages including Nazareth and Kokaba. They brought preservation of genealogical records, providing proof of their Davidic descent. This passage carries significance because Africanus was engaging in collection of information about Jewish Christian communities still possessing existence in Galilee 2 centuries following Jesus. His mention of Nazareth assumes readers possess knowledge. It's the hometown of Jesus, yet he's providing description of it as a real place housing real inhabitants, not a theological symbol. Origen, the prolific theologian from the 3rd century, makes mention of Nazareth in his writings. In his work opposing Celsus, he provides responses to pagan criticisms of Christianity. Celsus had engaged in mockery of the obscure origins of Jesus. Origen doesn't engage in dispute of Nazareth's insignificance. Rather, he advances the argument that God making the choice to work through humble means provides demonstration of divine wisdom rather than weakness. This exchange brings revelation that by the 3rd century, the obscurity of Nazareth was receiving use as ammunition deployed against Christian claims. Critics directed attention to the village's insignificance as evidence that Jesus couldn't be who Christians asserted. Defenders encountered the necessity of providing explanation for why God would make choice of such an unlikely location. The Talmud, receiving compilation over several centuries, yet containing traditions from the 1st century onward, makes mention of Nazareth only in oblique fashion. Some scholars provide identification of references to Nazareth in passages that employ similar-sounding Hebrew words, yet these identifications remain subject to contest. What stands clear is that Nazareth held no significance in Rabbinic Judaism except as the hometown of the figure Christians directed worship toward. One passage from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud tractate Sanhedrin, makes mention of a certain Jacob of Kephar Sekania, who advanced claims to heal in the name of Yeshu ben Panthera. Scholars engage in debate regarding whether Kephar Sekania could function as a reference to Nazareth, and whether this Yeshu is Jesus. The evidence possesses ambiguous character, yet it demonstrates that by the time the Talmud received compilation, rabbinic authorities possessed awareness of healing claims associated with someone named Yeshu. Epiphanius, a bishop from the 4th century, provides information more substantial in character. In his work titled Panarion, he provides descriptions of various heresies, including Jewish Christian groups. He makes mention of the Nazorians, a sect of Jewish believers in Jesus who lived in the region surrounding Nazareth. Epiphanius provides distinction of them from other groups and takes note of their continued Torah observance. His account provides suggestion that Nazareth remained associated with Jewish Christianity across centuries. The village received viewing as a center for believers who maintained Jewish identity while following Jesus. This makes sense in nature given that the own family of Jesus had provided leadership for the Jerusalem church before its destruction in the year 70 AD. Jerome, engaging in translation of the Bible into Latin during the late 4th century, provides comments on Nazareth in his notes. He had undertaken travel to Palestine and visited Christian sites of holiness. His description of Nazareth places emphasis on its smallness. He calls it a very small village and takes note that many Jews still live there alongside Christians. The observation from Jerome regarding the mixed population carries significance. By the 4th century, Christianity had transformed into the empire's dominant religion, yet Nazareth apparently retained a substantial Jewish community. The village hadn't undergone transformation into a Christian pilgrimage center in the way Bethlehem and Jerusalem had. The pilgrim Egeria, who engaged in travel through the Holy Land around the year 384 AD, makes mention of Nazareth in her travel diary. She provides description of visiting a cave, receiving identification as the site of the Annunciation. Local Christians showed her the place where they held belief that Mary had lived. The account from Egeria possesses value because it demonstrates Christian veneration of Nazareth sites was established by the late 4th century. Later, pilgrims contributed their own accounts. The Piacenza pilgrim, engaging in travel around the year 570 AD, provides description of Nazareth as having a synagogue where Jesus received education. He makes mention that the bench where Jesus sat was still subject to showing to visitors. Whether possessing authenticity or not, these traditions demonstrate how the village was receiving, remembering, and undergoing mythologizing. Notably absent from most early sources is any claim that Nazareth received invention. Even critics of Christianity who engaged in mockery of its origins didn't raise questions regarding whether Nazareth possessed existence. They raised questions regarding whether anything significant could emerge from such a place. The village's existence received acceptance. Its importance was what people engaged in arguing about. The so-called Nazareth inscription, or Nazareth decree, merits mention, though its connection to Nazareth possesses dubious character. This marble tablet, now residing in the Library of France, contains a Greek edict from a Roman emperor forbidding the disturbance of tombs. It reportedly received discovery in Nazareth in 1878. Some scholars once advanced the theory that this decree received issuing in response to Christian claims regarding the empty tomb of Jesus. More recent scholarship provides dating of the inscription to the reign of Claudius and establishes connection to disturbances in Greece, not Palestine. The provenance from Nazareth is itself subject to question. The inscription's only connection to the gospel story functions as coincidental. What strikes the careful observer is how late most extra-biblical references to Nazareth are in character. We don't receive solid non-Christian attestation until the 3rd century at the earliest point. This gap has brought trouble to some who desire earlier confirmation. Yet the gap makes sense in nature given the profile of Nazareth. Villages this small and insignificant simply didn't achieve making into historical records unless something extraordinary took place there. And something extraordinary did take place there, according to Christians. Yet that extraordinary thing required decades to undergo spreading and generations to transform into something culturally significant enough that historians directed attention. By the time Nazareth made appearance in non-Christian sources, it made appearance because Christianity had rendered it important, not because of any inherent significance. The early sources also bring revelation regarding something about how Nazareth received used rhetorically. For Christians, it transformed into proof of God's humility. For critics, it transformed into evidence of Christianity's dubious origins. The tiny village transformed into a symbol in competing narratives regarding what God accomplishes and how divine revelation functions. The relative silence of Jewish sources regarding Nazareth possesses more difficult character to interpret. Some view it as deliberate avoidance, a refusal to provide credence to Christian claims through acknowledging the place. Others take note that rabbinic literature directed focus toward legal matters and scriptural interpretation, not geography. A village in Galilee, possessing no temple connection and no famous sages, possessed no reason for appearance in such texts. What we can declare with confidence is that by the 3rd century, both Christian and non-Christian sources provide acknowledgement of Nazareth as a real place. The village's existence was not subject to dispute. What it signified, what had taken place there, and whether those events possessed cosmic significance remained matters of fierce debate. The scarcity of early references actually provides strengthening rather than weakening of the historical case. If Christians had engaged in invention of Nazareth, they would have provided it with an impressive pedigree. They would have established connection to Hebrew scripture prophecies or advanced claims that ancient patriarchs lived there. Instead, They found themselves stuck defending why God would make choice of such an unremarkable place. The embarrassment factor, as scholars provide calling for it, suggests authenticity. People don't engage in invention of details that make their claims more difficult to defend. The Gospel's insistence that Jesus arrived from Nazareth, despite the credibility problems this generated, directs attention to the claim being grounded in fact rather than receiving fabrication for theological purposes. As Christianity underwent spreading beyond Palestine, Nazareth receded in immediate importance. The theological doctrines held more importance than the geographical location. Yet for those who possessed knowledge of the region, who held understanding of Galilean social hierarchies, the mention of Nazareth triggered recognition. They understood precisely which location was under consideration. The additional sources from outside the Bible, limited though they may be, fulfill a narrow yet valuable role. They validate the fundamental structure. Nazareth existed as a modest Jewish settlement within Galilee. It was present during the 1st century, and its significance emerged through its connection to Jesus. Apart from these facts, the sources reveal more regarding how subsequent generations recalled and debated this location than about the actual place during Jesus' lifetime. History frequently operates in this manner. The most consequential occurrences take place in little-known settings that only gain prominence when looking back. Nazareth stayed overlooked for a longer period than most such places. However, once Christianity reshaped the Roman Empire and the world beyond, even this neglected settlement made its entrance into historical documentation. The sources available to us, meager as they might be, present a coherent narrative. Nazareth had genuine existence. It was diminutive in size. It held no particular importance. And yet, somehow, it became the place of origin for an individual who would divide history into the time before and the time after. From being unknown to becoming a destination for pilgrims, Nazareth, following the resurrection, the years that came after Jesus rose from the dead delivered massive transformations to the Jewish world. Jerusalem's devastation in the year 70 AD dispersed populations and crushed anticipations. The failure of the Bar Kokhba uprising in 135 AD finalized Jerusalem's conversion into a Roman metropolis that Jews were prohibited from entering. Set against this background of disaster and forced migration, Nazareth's narrative moved into a different phase. During the initial few generations following Jesus' passing, Nazareth continued as what it had always represented, a modest farming community. The distinction now was that it possessed holy meaning for an expanding movement of those who followed Jesus. Jewish followers, escaping Jerusalem's obliteration, distributed themselves across Galilee. A number went back to villages of their ancestors. Others looked for safety in settlements receptive to their teachings. Nazareth emerged as one hub of this scattered Jewish form of Christianity. The family members of Jesus, known as the Desposignoi, kept their presence throughout the area. These relatives held unique standing within the early communities of Christians, connecting followers to Jesus by way of actual family lineage. Their accounts concerning Jesus' years in Nazareth would have held great value. Epiphanius, composing his writings during the 4th century, mentions a Jewish Christian group known as the Nazareans residing in that region. These followers upheld Jewish legal traditions while remaining devoted to Jesus. They stood apart from Gentile Christians in their practices, yet remained joined in their beliefs. Nazareth itself evidently kept a diverse mix of Jews, Jewish Christians, and in time, Gentile Christians as well. The first Christian buildings in Nazareth were most likely simple structures. Jewish Christian worship at the outset revolved around private homes and modified spaces instead of specially constructed churches. The synagogue practice of communal assembly in specific rooms shaped early Christian customs. In a settlement as tiny as Nazareth, the complete Christian gathering could assemble in one spacious residence. The custom of marking particular sites as holy locations started quite early. Those who made pilgrimages in subsequent centuries spoke of being guided to the location of the Annunciation, the place where Joseph had his workshop, and additional sites linked to Jesus' earthly life. Certain of these traditions might retain authentic recollection. Others probably emerged as devout speculation, filled in the missing information. The revolution brought about by Constantine during the early part of the 4th century changed Christian circumstances across the empire. With support from the emperor, Christians gained the ability to construct buildings publicly and practice their faith in the open. Helena, the mother of Constantine, journeyed to Palestine approximately in the year 326 AD, locating and designating holy sites. Although later accounts credit her with establishing numerous churches, the actual historical documentation remains less definite regarding Nazareth. The initial significant church structure in Nazareth seems to trace back to the Byzantine era, most likely from the 4th or 5th century. Constructed above the cave that tradition identified as the home of Mary, this church set the precedent that would persist through later periods. Every new church structure would rise above the one that came before, forming successive levels of religious devotion and architectural design. Pilgrims from the Byzantine era recorded descriptions of their journeys. The pilgrim from Piacenza, making his travels around the year 570 AD, recounts what he witnessed. The Church of the Annunciation, the place of worship where Jesus learned, the seat where Jesus rested. Some of these locations were without question genuine. Others represented the results of eager tradition, ready to designate relics and places based on scant proof. What stands out as noteworthy is that Nazareth never rose to become a principal destination for pilgrims during the Byzantine period. Jerusalem commanded Christian focus. Bethlehem attracted pilgrims to the narrative of Jesus' birth. Locations surrounding the Sea of Galilee marked Jesus' public work. Nazareth stayed comparatively peaceful, receiving visits from some travelers, yet never reaching the prominence of more important sites. The Persian attack of 614 AD brought devastation to numerous churches throughout Palestine. Whether the churches of Nazareth experienced destruction remains uncertain from the sources that have survived. The Arab conquest that followed during the 7th century introduced fresh difficulties. Christian populations found themselves existing under Islamic governance, their holy sites now subject to different political and religious forces. During the early period of Islamic authority, Christians generally received tolerance as people of the book. Churches already in existence could continue, although constructing new ones encountered limitations. The Christian community of Nazareth persisted, keeping worship alive at their customary sites. The settlement itself stayed modest in size, its residents representing a mixture of Christians, Muslims, and perhaps some Jewish people. The era of the Crusaders introduced profound transformation. When Latin Christians seized control of Palestine in the year 1099, they began the task of reconstructing churches at locations considered sacred. In Nazareth, the Crusaders built a magnificent basilica above the Byzantine remnants. This church structure, finished in 1170, ranked among the most impressive Crusader constructions in the Holy Land. Its combination of Romanesque design with regional architectural elements showed both European impact and adjustment to local circumstances. Crusader Nazareth also witnessed the building of more churches. The Church of St. Joseph went up close to the Church of the Annunciation. A church honoring the synagogue where Jesus provided instruction was raised. The settlement shifted from a humble community to a compact town focused on pilgrimage, its financial system growing increasingly reliant on visitors coming for religious purposes. This era turned out to be short-lived. Following Saladin's triumph at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Crusader authority over Galilee crumbled. Nazareth came under the control of Muslim armies. The church buildings were not torn down, but instead were repurposed for different functions or simply shut. The population of Latin Christians either escaped or scattered. Throughout the following multiple centuries, Nazareth returned to peaceful anonymity. Under the rule of the Mamluks and subsequently the Ottomans, it existed as a village comparable to numerous others. Christian groups continued to survive, though they encountered occasional limitations and difficulties. The imposing Crusader church structures deteriorated over time, their detailed stonework falling apart as roofing gave way and walls wore down. The Franciscan custody of the Holy Land, holding responsibility for Catholic locations in the territory, made efforts to keep a foothold in Nazareth. By the time of the 17th century, Franciscans had obtained authorization to hold services at the decaying Church of the Annunciation. They progressively restored and reconstructed sections of the building, operating within the boundaries of Ottoman restrictions. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed gradual expansion in the Christian population of Nazareth. Different Christian denominations formed communities and erected churches. The Greek Orthodox Church put up a church above a water source they claimed as the authentic location of the Annunciation. The Greek Catholics, Maronites, and additional Eastern Christian groups constructed their own places for worship. Interest from Europe and Palestine increased throughout the 19th century. Those making pilgrimages traveled in growing quantities, their trips facilitated by better means of transportation. Nazareth turned into a regular location on the Holy Land route. Authors released descriptions of their experiences, portraying the village, its religious buildings, and its varied residents. Mark Twain, paying a visit in 1867, characterized Nazareth as a dirty, insignificant town featuring tight streets and inferior housing. His description, though colored with characteristic Twain doubt, captures a portion of the village's actual condition. In spite of its holy connections, Nazareth stayed materially impoverished, its inhabitants existing much in the same way their forebears had for hundreds of years. The latter part of the 19th century introduced organized archaeological curiosity. Scholars from Europe started examining Palestine's historic locations in a scientific manner, instead of merely attempting to verify biblical accounts. Nazareth drew interest as the hometown of Jesus, although excavation work stayed restricted. The beginning of the 20th century introduced political turmoil. The fall of the Ottoman Empire following World War I put Palestine under the British mandate. This time period witnessed rising competing forms of nationalism and religious strains. Nazareth, containing its mixed residents of Arab Christians and Muslims, moved through these pressures with different degrees of achievement. In the year 1955, construction started on a fresh basilica intended to take the place of the crumbling building above the Annunciation Grotto. The undertaking, reaching completion in 1969, produced the present-day Church of the Annunciation. Contemporary in its design, while still incorporating features from previous churches, it rises above Nazareth, a clear declaration of Christian existence. The excavation stage of the construction uncovered considerable remnants from previous eras, mosaics from the Byzantine period, capitals from the Crusader time, and underneath everything, the chambers carved from rock belonging to the Roman-era village. These findings verify the location's extended history of religious reverence while offering tangible proof of Nazareth's modest beginnings. Contemporary Nazareth exists as an active city containing more than 75,000 residents, representing the biggest Arab city in the area. The historic village core now finds itself encircled by contemporary districts extending across the hillsides. Churches belonging to different denominations mark the urban landscape, each one standing for a separate thread of Christianity's intricate past. The industry based on pilgrimage continues to hold economic importance. Hundreds of thousands of those visiting come each year, exploring the holy locations, buying religious keepsakes, and forming connections with the starting points of their faith. The city has expanded to handle this flow of visitors, offering hotels, places to eat, and tour operations serving those traveling for religious reasons. Still, friction continues between what is sacred and what is ordinary. Nazareth functions as a living urban center with educational institutions, commercial enterprises, congested traffic, and all the complexities that come with contemporary city existence. It does not exist as a museum preserved in a particular moment, but rather as a location where individuals reside, earn their living, and deal with present-day obstacles. The change from little-known village to destination for religious travelers required multiple centuries. It occurred not due to anything built into the place itself, but because those who believed gave it significance. The rock formations and earth of Nazareth differ in no way from rock formations and earth found in any other location. What renders them holy is the account people share regarding the events that took place there. This pattern shows itself repeatedly across Christian history. Common locations transform into remarkable ones through their link to divine action. The assertion that God operates through physical reality, through particular moments in time and specific locations, naturally generates sacred geography. Nazareth represents perhaps the clearest illustration of this process. From the settlement that formed Jesus to the destination that forms those who make pilgrimages, the path of Nazareth mirrors Christianity's own evolution. Both started out small and pushed to the margins. Both encountered rejection and suffered persecution. Both expanded far past their starting points while keeping ties to that particular location in Lower Galilee. The person visiting Nazareth in modern times experiences multiple layers of historical record and significance: stones from ancient times, church structures from medieval days, streets from the present era. Every layer contributes a portion of the account. Each one stands for a community's effort to pay respect to what they held as truth about events in this location 2,000 years in the past. Whether the particular sites marked by tradition prove to be accurate holds less importance than the wider reality they embody. In some part of this modest area of Galilee, a young person matured who would alter the course of the world. The exact spot of his residence might remain unknown. That he possessed a residence in an actual location among actual human beings remains essential to Christian assertions regarding the Incarnation. The shift of Nazareth from being unknown to becoming a pilgrimage destination shows us that importance does not exist inherently, but gets attributed. Locations hold meaning due to the events occurring within them, and due to communities making the choice to keep the memory alive. The settlement that once struggled to even appear on maps of history now pulls in believers from every part of the globe. The journey carries on. Every generation contributes its own layer to the story of Nazareth, understanding and re-understanding what this location signifies. And below all of it, the foundation of limestone continues to exist. The identical stone that saw a craftsman working with wood alongside his son, a household consuming basic meals, a young boy studying Torah within the synagogue.